Отец Глеб Якунин – человек-эпоха, соединивший в себе священника, диссидента-правозащитника, политика и поэта. Он родился в 1934 году, а в 1965-м публично заявил о советских гонениях на религию и обвинил церковных иерархов в сговоре с государством. Его преследовали за антисоветскую деятельность. Он провел 5 лет в лагере, был сослан в Сибирь. В 90-е он стал депутатом и обнародовал архивные материалы о сотрудничестве клириков РПЦ с КГБ, за что с него сняли сан и отлучили от церкви. Тогда он создал другую церковь и продолжал защищать право всех людей на свободу совести. В 2014-м он поддержал Киевский Майдан, увидев в нем образ государства и церкви будущего. Отец Глеб ушел в мир иной в 2014 году на Рождество. Мы организовали Якунинские чтения в 2016-м, чтобы продолжить его дело защиты всех верующих от церковно-государственных преследований.
Доклад, я его буду переводить, поэтому я сейчас включу опцию перевода. Уоллес будет делать доклад на английском. Я буду переводить синхронно. Wallace, you don't have to stop because we have an option of the translation. Those who want to listen to the translation, they will push the button for the translation. They will listen just to me. So you don't have to stop every other sentence.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The topic of my talk, can you hear me okay? The topic of my talk concerns Father Gleb Yakunin and his critique of the complicit spirit, a euphemism for the Russian patriarchate during the Soviet Union and its aftermath. The term complicit spirit is derived from Czeslaw Miłosz's classic book-length essay, The Captive Mind, written shortly after Miłosz left Poland in the post-war period. Before he left Poland and his native Lithuania, Miłosz had recently witnessed several horrific events. Stalin's tanks in the streets of Vilnius, the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, 16 days after the German army marched into that country from the West. After the war, unhappy about the Stalinist control of the Polish government, Miłosz went into exile in Paris. There he wrote The Captive Mind, which seeks to explain why so many thinking people choose to give away their independent lives and collaborate with an authoritarian government. What is there so attractive about authoritarianism and a tyrannical leader who offers an imaginary world? A leader who pledges to take away a person's doubts and major concerns. That is the question Miłosz explores. It is also a question that we too face in the 21st century, when many countries have gone the way of authoritarian governments and tyrannical leaders. These authoritarian leaders are extremely seductive, as The Captive Mind points out. They define one's place in society. They provide an illusion of happiness. They propose answers in the place of doubts and confusion. They offer what Miłosz calls the new faith. This new faith seduces the individual to surrender the self, submit to a higher authority, and accept without questioning the truth proclaimed by this authoritarian power. This truth requires complicity with authoritarian power, and it makes war on democracy, on freedom of the spirit, and on a person's right to make one's own way. As such, this way of being goes much beyond the political. It portrays a way of thinking, of relinquishing the self, of forsaking human creativity for a false sense of security and comfort. Miłosz calls this a sickness, an unhealthy condition in which human beings and entire societies give up their personhood for something magical, something fantastical, and something utterly seductive. This was the mindset that Father Gleb Yakunin fought against for all of his adult life. He understood, too, that it fostered lies and delusions that promoted ultra-nationalism and war. His struggles with this mindset began when he was a student at the Zoological Institute, if not before that. His path to a different way of thinking and being came, in part, from within himself. All my life, he told me, I have been a fighter, a rebel against unexamined thinking, injustices, and arbitrary power. Two main sources are among those that fostered his rebellion. The first was his discovery in Nikolai Berdyaev's Philosophia Svobody, published in 1911, a decade before Berdyaev's banishment from the Soviet state. Yakunin was introduced to this work when he was a student in Irkutsk, and he found the book both captivating and instructive for the future. Freedom, according to Berdyaev, required that a person must make a choice between hearing one's own calling or submitting to some earthly authority. Berdyaev contrasted this personal freedom to the mentality of the crowd and the pressure to conform. Christianity did not lead to a feeling of dependence and weakness, but to a sense of independence and strength. The second source of his relationship the second source was his relationship with his fellow student, Alexander Mien, the future priest and Yakunin's longtime friend. I have written elsewhere about the importance of their friendship, but suffice it to repeat here that it was deeply influential for Yakunin and gave him a different perspective on Christianity and its call for freedom of the spirit than he had understood before. Men viewed the incarnation as a call to creativity, a tangible summons to love one's neighbor, to reach out to the world, not to submit to some outside authority. In his narrative poem, Chwalebny, Prymityw, Uradivy, w cześć Boga, Mirozdania, Rodinu, which he began while serving a 5-year term in the labor camp, Yakunin emphasized his debt to Father Alexander for opening his eyes to a deeper and clearer conception of Christianity than he had previously known. Father Gleb's critique of the complicit spirit may be exemplified in several specific ways. His criticism was not expressed in some lengthy treatise, but in his activities and appeals to the patriarch and to the governmental authorities. I shall mention 4 of them. First, the patriarch's complicity with the atheistic Soviet government served as a major theme in the letter he and Father Nikolai Eshleman sent to Patriarch Alexei I in November 1965. The letter implored the Patriarch to stand up for the Church and its sacred mission, rather than passively bow down before state power. They reminded the Patriarch of the Church's significance, its role in defining and protecting the identity of the Russian people. By the internal law of her existence, the writers of the letter argued, the Church cannot renounce her calling to enlighten, to transform the whole of human life, to imbue it with her rays, end quote. Rather than counter the prevailing communist ideology, however, the Church had complied with this primitive ideology and failed to articulate a dissenting view. By this compliance, the writers of the letter maintained, the Church betrayed its sacred mission. The same allegation appeared in the famous appeal Yakunin and Lev Regelson made to the World Council of Churches in October 1975. Their appeal depicted a wave of anti-religious terror initiated by the Soviet government against churches and believers of all kinds. The Russian Patriarchate's submission to the Soviet government, Yakunin and Regelson wrote, made it useless to address their plea for the intervention to their own church authorities. The second example concerned the Patriarchate's contributions to the cult of the leader in the late 1970s. Father Gleb wrote a penetrating essay published in Samizdat, connecting the Moscow Patriarchate and the cult of Stalin. Republished a decade later in a volume of essays on perestroika and democracy, Yakunin explored some of the fundamental causes of what he called the mental captivity that nourished the cult of personality. The slavish devotion of Orthodox church leaders to Stalin constituted a primary cause in the cult, in the creation of the cult. Their praise of Stalin, glorifying him as a leader of genius and great builder of the people's happiness, expressed a reverential feeling of devotion that the patriarch bestowed on the Soviet leader. In 1949, on the occasion of Stalin's 70th birthday, Patriarch Alexei I spoke of the sincere gratitude he felt for Stalin's personal sacrifices for the freedom and well-being of the Russian people. His words offered more than political praise. They conveyed a religious awe that transcended politics, a sacrificial fidelity that covered up the killings of millions of Soviet citizens. Most important, the cult concealed the lies that henceforth had become a central feature of Russia's political and religious culture. Third, the complicity between the Moscow Patriarchate and the state was perhaps most dramatically depicted in the revelations from the KGB archives in 1991-1992. Father Gleb's exploration of these archives opened a Pandora's box of issues concerning the integrity of the leadership of the church. The collaboration between the KGB and nearly every level of the church hierarchy, which Father Gleb documented, revealed a whole panoply of compromises made by church officials to protect and enhance their own well-being at the expense of believers. Fourth, prior to becoming patriarch, Metropolitan Kirill wrote an alternative to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He revised the first article of the Declaration by connecting human rights and dignity not to a God-given right, but to morality. He proclaimed that by doing good, a person acquired human dignity. Dignity, in other words, must be earned. In August 2008, the Russian People's Assembly adopted Metropolitan Kirill's revision. Taking strong exception to this, Father Gleb termed Kirill's revision a, quote, quasi-religious orientation, end quote, and a potential danger to Russian democracy. According to Kirill, the distinction between good and evil is determined by Russia's religious tradition. This greatly troubled Father Gleb Yakunin. If adopted, he said, it would potentially become the basis for a new national ideology. It would promote the deification of the state and undermine the democratic foundation of Russian society. In conclusion, Father Gleb knew well that mental and spiritual liberation from tyranny depended on more than simple political and economic change. Liberation required a fresh look at the historical reasons underlying the control of the mind or the mastery of the human spirit, as Czeslaw Miłosz referred to the flight from reason to illusion. An authoritarian government propagated a collective magic. It sought to remove the boundaries between truth and fantasy. Ultra-nationalism fed on the removal of these boundaries and in fostering an illusion of power. Father Gleb Yakunin repeatedly warned about the dangers and their destruction of the human spirit. In his life and his activities, he fought against them, knowing that they bred the social conditions for violence and war that have been so strikingly exposed in the last year by President Putin's assault on Ukraine and on the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.